Tristan de Luna came to the New World as a boy in 1530. His father, a conquistador, became governor of the Yucatan, and his cousin married Hernan Cortez. Throughout his youth, another cousin served as the Viceroy of New Spain. Young Tristán had some large footsteps to follow in. As such, he joined Coronado in his search of the American Southwest for the legendary Seven Cities of Cibola, ending in failure, but nonetheless sparking a career as a reliable soldier in an unpredictable world. Now, in the year 1558, the new viceroy appoints de Luna captain general of a fleet organized to settle the Florida Peninsula. Sometime in 1559, he was appointed governor of Florida. But in contrast with past episodes of this season, de Luna's colony would be an offshoot of sorts of New Spain, not a colonization effort from Cuba or Spain directly. And de Luna's powers as governor would be not as broad as his predecessors. In fact, you could think of him as an employee of the Viceroy of New Spain, where if everything went well, Florida might be spun off at some point. The Viceroy himself was tasked by the king with creating a chain of forts and ports from Mexico to the east coast of North America for a possible overland route for all the treasure being plundered from Central America. This is what spurred on the colonization effort of Florida once again. The Viceroy made a plan of government for de Luna to follow. He also made all the arrangements and purchases for the colony and even designed the first proposed settlement and hopefully future capital of Spanish Florida. He planned a town center surrounded by orderly streets, 100 houses to be built for 100 families he would transport to Florida. There would be a governor's mansion and a wall surrounding the whole settlement. The mansion would double as a fortress that could hold the entire population of the city if it were attacked. Beyond this, there would be a chain of fortifications running through the native land of the Coosa, connecting a settlement west of the Florida Peninsula with one at Santa Elena in modern-day South Carolina, hopefully providing that aforementioned overland route. The Viceroy envisioned this chain someday extending back into Mexico. And if it all worked out, he wanted to drive 5,000 head of cattle into Florida from Mexico. Of course, it's easy to draft such things on paper. De Luna would have to make this a reality. And the track record the Spanish have in colonizing what they call Spanish Florida, which would be most of North America north of Mexico, is bleak. This season, we've seen 3 men try and 3 men die in their attempts to colonize Spanish Florida. The most recent attempt, not an episode of its own in this program, but worth mentioning here, a Catholic priest named Luis de Balbastro landed at Tampa Bay with a mission to convert the natives through friendship. And as he knelt down on the beach to plant a cross, a native bashed in his head. As you can imagine, after so many failed attempts, the Spanish more often than not found opportunities elsewhere. But de Luna had the financial backing of the prominent leaders of New Spain, and the Viceroy assembled for this effort, over the course of a year, 500 soldiers, 1,000 settlers, 5 Catholic priests, and 1 lay brother, along with 240 horses, 11 or 13 ships, it's debatable. A massive undertaking with vast potential if it were to be successful. Just to remind the listener, think of the impact the settlers of Plymouth 2 generations later had on North American history. They numbered only 102 upon landing in New England. De Luna's fleet sailed all the way to the Mississippi River before being driven back to the Yucatan by contrary winds. Still resolute, they tried again, and after a long 66-day voyage from Mexico, de Luna lands at Pensacola, August 14th, 1559. Sometimes he receives credit for founding Pensacola, the name itself being indigenous in origin. Instead, de Luna names the land Bahia Filipina del Puerto de Santa Maria. He found the land so beautiful, he immediately wrote a letter to the Viceroy, gave it to a group of colonists, and sent them back to Mexico to deliver a glowing report requesting further colonists. These letters, and really all the first-hand documents written by de Luna, were only rediscovered in the 1920s and published by Herbert Ingram Presley, which helps explain why de Luna to this day remains an obscure figure. Before this trove of letters were found, the best primary account we have is from Father Domingo, one of the Catholic priests who joined de Luna to Pensacola. And he is still the major source for a lot of the day-to-day details and conversations. Even so, his oral account was only written down 30 or so years after the fact by another priest named Father Padilla. It's important to know where these stories are coming from. De Luna also quickly created two groups of colonists, one of which would travel by land, and the other would take a small boat upriver to explore the region. Each group was given 3 or 4 days' worth of food and were expected to return in that time. The original plan was to travel the distance of Florida and arrive on the East Coast to build their capital at a place the Spanish called again Santa Elena in modern-day South Carolina. The Spanish felt that the overland trip would be safer and faster than rounding the peninsula with boats, for which they feared the shoals and the weather. And on that note, 5 or 6 days after landing, De Luna's initial optimism was blown away quite literally by a hurricane, which killed many of his settlers, destroyed most of his ships and supplies, including the food and trade goods intended for the natives. Only 4 of his ships survived. The only supplies that could be recovered were found in a single caravel that seemed to have been purposefully driven onto the ocean rocks. Whomever thought to pull off this feat did not survive the hurricane, but would be a hero to many. A bit off topic here, but the remains of 2 of his ships have been discovered in the modern era. Something you can look up on your own. De Luna gathered his survivors, perhaps 1,000 in total, and took stock of their meager supplies. The colonists wanted to relocate the colony after such an obvious and violent display of nature, or pack it in altogether. But De Luna reassured the people that the Viceroy would send quick resupply. Indeed, the earlier ship that De Luna had sent back would miss the hurricane, but the report that De Luna gave them to deliver to the Viceroy would not suggest they needed more supplies. And in fact, they would be sending more people, more hungry mouths, to join this colonization endeavor. So De Luna can reassure his people, but he truly doesn't know when any relief will be provided. Both scouting parties sent out before the hurricane returned days after their food ran out. Some took to eating random plants and they fell ill. They returned from their fruitless search to witness the aftermath of the storm. Starving, they were hoping to tap into a year's worth of provisions that were no more. And similarly, the survivors of the hurricane had their hopes hung upon good news from the scouting parties. Consequently, everyone found a reason to be crestfallen. The scouting parties reported to De Luna that despite the initial appearance of Pensacola, the land was barren of anything the Spaniards recognized as food, and there were no natives to be found. Such a beautiful area, the Spanish now feared it was inhospitable to human life. De Luna, even if he believed such things, lacked the boats necessary to evacuate the colony. He had about a month's worth of rations for everybody, and he would need to stretch that out for an indefinite amount of time if he could not secure new stores. At the same time, De Luna fell ill and had fevers that impaired his ability to give intelligible speech. His men found him delirious. Nonetheless, in a coherent moment, he sent 4 companies of soldiers inland to search for anything, going deeper than the previous scouting groups. Eventually, they find a small, mostly abandoned village the natives call Nanipacana. Hernando de Soto invaded this area 20 years prior, and beside the direct effects, left old world diseases behind, which may explain why the panhandle of Florida was nearly depopulated now. And unfortunately for these poor souls living in this small village, they were sitting on the only supply of food that the Spanish could account for. In February of 1560, De Luna moves his entire colony to the village, about 120 miles away from Pensacola, and names this settlement Santa Cruz de Nanipacana. The villagers flee, but many were captured by the Spanish. The 1,000 or so settlers quickly deplete the food supply of the small village, as a good amount of it was carried off by the natives who managed to escape. The men took to eating what they described as bitter acorns, which women and children could not stomach. They took to wandering the woods and eating plants at random, or eating leather after they boiled it for a long while. Needless to say, the people began dying. The poor captive natives, overwhelmed with their unwelcomed guests, told the men of a chiefdom rich in food named Coosa. To quote the Spanish historian Barcia in his classic History of Florida,
as they beheld themselves lost and close to death, and unable to escape. Their general distress was so profound that they began to make their dispositions with the religious for quitting this life. At the height of this desperate state of affairs, the general received news of the province of Coosa.
When the natives spoke the name of Coosa, 6 veteran soldiers among the Spanish felt a spark of recognition. These captains in de Luna's army were survivors of de Soto's expedition. These men remembered 2 decades prior walking through fields of corn that stretched village to village, and where the forests remained, they were full of edible plants. The paramount chief of the Coosa, carried place to place on a litter, was seized with little effort, and de Soto was able to take freely from one end of the chief's domain to the other. Also present was a woman from Coosa, who had been taken by de Soto's men all those years ago. The chance to return home must have been irresistible to her. The Spanish now hoped that Coosa remained rich in food and equally weak in defense. And after all, de Luna was ordered to establish a post at Coosa along his way to Santa Elena. And so, with literally no other prospects, de Luna sent a detachment of 200 men under Sergeant Major Mateo del So to find Coosa. But none of the natives knew exactly how to get there, and so de Soto's veterans would have to serve as guides. As we learned in our 2nd and 3rd episodes on de Soto, however, he reached Coosa by the way of the East Coast, and left Coosa without ever reaching his boats at Pensacola. In other words, his veterans never actually made the trip they were about ready to undertake. Father Domingo, our main narrative source for this story, went with them, and so our tale leaves de Luna at Nanipacana and follows the 200 men to Coosa. And so with only a general sense of direction, the men marched a grueling 50 days. Some died along the way, ingesting poisonous plants. The trusty bitter acorns kept the rest of the men alive, and yet little more than bags of skin and bones. After 50 days, they reached the village of Ulubahali, a village that in the time of de Soto served as the gateway between the northern half and southern half of the Coosa paramount chiefdom. This is also the only village in Coosa that gave de Soto a genuine resistance after taking the chief. As such, the Spanish now set up camp a respectful distance from the village, and then sent in interpreters with gifts. Luckily for them, the interpreters returned with food. Within a few days, an emissary appeared, dressed in fine skins and long plumes of colorful feathers. This man explained that he came from the paramount village of Coosa to guide the Spanish to the chief himself. The Spanish were overjoyed and quickly packed up camp and followed the guide, who led them out of the area and then within a day or two disappeared. The Spanish concluded that this man was no emissary after all, but merely a man from Ulubahali seeking to lead the Spanish away from his village. Some of the men wanted to return and seek vengeance against the villagers, but the majority decided it would be best to push ahead to Coosa, which, despite everything, the men actually managed to find. But then de Soto's veterans noticed that everything seemed very off, very different from what they remembered. Coosa was now a small village of just 30 houses, with only 7 satellite villages around it, a shell of what it had been 2 decades prior. And even between these villages, the maize fields used to stretch settlement to settlement, they were now overgrown. Little did they know, they were witnessing the medium-term effects of their own previous invasion. They were greeted by the paramount chief of the Coosa himself, evidently not the same man de Soto took captive 20 years before, but a younger relation who was likely still old enough to remember the Spanish invasion of 1540 and had a better sense of these men than his predecessor. This new chief, as we have seen with many Mississippian chiefdoms, was carried place to place on a platform. His bearers themselves were nobles and lesser chiefs. The Coosa were still strong enough to support their non-productive leadership. This chief blamed and chastised the Spanish for the fallen state of the Coosa, but took in the men and fed them nonetheless, because the Coosa faced a more immediate threat from the Napochies, who lived to the northwest, somewhere around modern-day Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Napochies used to pay tribute to the Coosa, but were now in rebellion killing the Coosa and others in their domain, taking scalps as trophies. The Coosa and the Spanish then agreed to an alliance. The Coosa would house and feed the Spanish, and in return the Spanish would fight alongside the Coosa to subdue the Napochies. And the Spanish would be allowed to take any food found at Napochies. Until the Coosa decided on the right time to attack, the Spanish would live among them. Father Domingo records that the men, hungry as they were, ate moderately so as not to anger the Coosa. These were tough Spanish soldiers, but they were also at the mercy of the Coosa, and the Coosa knew it. Father Domingo also took it upon himself to inquire as to the fate of the two men left behind by Tesoto 20 years before, a Spaniard named Falco Jurado and a black man named Robles. The Coosa told Father Domingo that these men lived for 11 or 12 years before dying. A few authors covering De Luna assume that these men were adopted into the clans of the Coosa, but the fact that the men never married, had children, or even had adopted relatives, it appears to me anyway, that they were never fully integrated into Coosa society. It is also possible that the Coosa quickly did away with the men and were simply now making up a story that the Spanish would more likely accept. The Spanish lived with the Coosa for about 3 months, seemingly having little concern for De Luna and the rest of the colonists at Nanipacana. The men searched the hills for gold and silver, finding none. Toward the end of this time, in July of 1560, the Coosa, now well prepared, called upon their Spanish friends to honor their end of the agreement and attack the Napochies. The Coosa chief raised 300 of his own men, and the Spanish volunteered 50 foot soldiers and a few horsemen to serve as their auxiliaries. They also gave the chief a horse to ride into battle with the guidance of an enslaved African who had experience with horses. As the combined army marched toward their target, the chief would have the men stop in order to give great speeches at regular intervals, vengeance being the consistent theme. But when coming upon the Napochies village, they found it abandoned, but only recently so. The fire still crackling, food still cooking. The Coosa rushed to the center square of the town, where upon a post they found the scalps of their dead loved ones. At this, the Coosa flew into a fevered rage and burned down the town. In the process, they found an old man too feeble to flee with the rest. Father Domingo rushed to convert the man before the Coosa would have their way with him, but it was too late. The warriors fell upon him and beat him to death. The scalps were removed for respectful interment, and the food, collected as a Spanish prize, was transported back to Coosa. With the village of Napochies now in ashes, the Coosa chief, not satisfied with this, vowed to hunt down the Napochies themselves. And in the days to come, the two combined forces managed to find the Napochies standing on the other side of a great river, taunting the Coosa, certain that no one would be able to cross. But the Coosa knew of a shallow point in the river where the chief directed the Spanish to cross in secret, if possible. While his men kept appearances from across the Napochies, the Spanish traveled to this shallow spot, only to discover the Napochies taking sentry on the other side. Likely, this is where they crossed the river in the first place. The Spanish began to wade across, moving slowly, burdened by their heavy metal armor. The Napochies laughed at their progress and saw no reason to fear such men, strange as they may appear. At this, a Spaniard, midstream, fired his gun, killing a Napochies warrior instantly. The shock was enough to rip the courage away from the Napochies, who fled into the woods. The Spanish now steadily pursued them. A native warrior on any given day could travel faster than a Spaniard foot soldier, but the Napochies were hungry, dispossessed, sleep-deprived, and moving as a village of people. This pursuit was not a foot race between young men, and while the Spanish closed in from one direction, a detachment of the Coosa found a second crossing and approached the Napochies from another direction. Their chief had no choice but to sue for peace. The Coosa and Spanish reserved judgment for the Coosa chief himself and marched the Napochies across the river, where the chief remained, their fate his alone to decide. The Napochies submitted to his authority and begged for forgiveness, and the Coosa chief pardoned them, on condition that they give tribute 3 times a year in fruits and nuts. They would otherwise be left to rebuild their village and face the oncoming winter without their stores of food. Such would be the punishment for their disobedience. Returning victoriously to Coosa, the Spanish finally decide to send word of their deeds to De Luna, where De Luna, after having heard no word from them in months, figured them all for dead and left Nanipacana June 22nd, 1560, with somewhere south of 800 surviving colonists, and returned to Pensacola and eventually traveled on to the Mobile Bay area, desperately living off the land and hoping a boat would arrive from New Spain with provisions. At the coast, finding no ships, they built two of their own, rough as they were, and sent a small number of brave colonists out into the open ocean in the general direction of Havana, Cuba. And just in case anyone returned from Coosa to Nanipacana, he left this information in a glass jar that he buried alongside a tree, where the words "dig below" were carved. The Spanish messengers from Coosa, well fed, emboldened by their victory, and having a better sense of direction than at their outset, made the trek in just 12 days, finding the message, and then took another 3 days traveling to the coast, worried all the while that De Luna had evacuated the colonists in boats, or that they had all starved to death. Both groups of colonists were shocked by the survival of the other. But the messengers from Coosa reported that the Coosa of 20 years prior was no longer. Coosa was a mere shadow of its former self and needed the Spanish to help them subdue their tributaries. Moreover, they had food, but not in the quantities needed to support De Luna's colony. De Luna, likely assessing the physique of the Spanish from Coosa, was in disbelief. Clearly, these men were doing far better than his resident group of colonists. He resolves to travel to Coosa himself. This triggers among his weary army the first stirrings of a mutiny. De Luna's men were worn down, and many believed that the time had long since arrived to abandon the colony. The idea of venturing inland and away from the lifeline of the coast was simply unacceptable. It did not work for Narvaez nor De Soto. There was no reason to believe that De Luna's leadership would prove to be any better. To thwart De Luna's plan, his own captains send messengers to the Spanish at Coosa, recalling them to the coast. Father Domingo records that the Coosa were genuinely saddened by their departure, which is certainly possible. The Spanish here were few in number and so weren't intimidating to the Coosa, and yet in battle they were such a novelty against an enemy force, the psychological edge would be dearly missed. De Luna was furious when the men returned from Coosa. Being one man, he depended on everyone else having a sense of duty and loyalty to maintain control. Now the men outwardly developed the habit of balking at De Luna's orders, paying him lip service, or doing tasks so slow or half-heartedly as to negate their effect. This quickly turned into complete non-compliance, many believing De Luna to be mentally compromised by his earlier illness, which seemed to have been returning. Some of De Luna's captains wanted to take a small ship De Luna still had and use it to transport the very ill back to New Spain. De Luna, still fuming over the Coosa situation, refused such an arrangement, but perhaps realizing his men were going to undertake this task anyway, and if he denied them, the fiction of his remaining authority would be revealed. And so De Luna told these captains they could do as they pleased in this regard without approval or support from himself. And 100 of the sickest colonists were packed into this boat, which made it back to New Spain, where the Viceroy promptly imprisoned the captain of the ship for desertion. De Luna, on his end, decided to charge two soldiers who he suspected as being organizers of the resistance with desertion. They were both quickly found guilty and sentenced to death. At this, a large part of the army rose up and prevented harm to come to these two men. And the Spanish were now divided into two camps that had tenuous control over the hungry people of their own factions. Fights broke out, and everyone lived in fear of a spontaneous and deadly battle among fellow countrymen. On Palm Sunday, celebrating the day Jesus rode into Jerusalem, Father Domingo, and remember this is his own account, held a service publicly questioning de Luna's faith, asking him to admit the errors of his ways and reconcile with his officers. Father Domingo had a prophecy that if de Luna were to do this, a relief ship would arrive in 3 days' time. De Luna stood up and gave the following speech.
Gentlemen, from the time I left Mexico, I have not intended to offend anyone. I have endeavored only to discharge the obligation under which the king has placed me to the best of my judgment, which is based upon the wisdom of others wiser than I. However, in the present dissension, I have been at fault. With all my heart, I now ask your pardon for the wrong which malice or my own ignorance may have caused, and I pardon any of those who may have offended me.
De Luna had more to say, but he fell silent as the men came forward and knelt before him, begging his forgiveness. Overall, an emotional mass that diffused a powder keg of a situation. It is likely Father Domingo and de Luna orchestrated their interactions ahead of time, and it had its desired effect. And wouldn't you know it, just the next day, the supply ships arrive even sooner than prophesized. Some sources claim the ships arrived 2 days later, but it makes for a better story if it's 1 day, right? As it turns out, the 2 boats de Luna had sent to Havana made quick time for Cuba, only to find the island governor there refuse any help except to provide a proper ship to send the men to Veracruz, where they had to take the overland trip all the way to Mexico City to then request an audience from the Viceroy. Now relief had finally arrived in Florida. The people were overjoyed and certain of God's grace, given yesterday's events. But in command of the supply ships was a conquistador named Angel de Vizafañe, the Viceroy's pick to replace de Luna as governor. The reports given to the Viceroy by the colonists de Luna sent out destroyed all confidence he had in de Luna. Governor Vizafañe gathers the officers of his new colony, and the majority agree that the Spanish should abandon Florida and return to Mexico. De Luna, although diminished, disagreed and requested that a few men remain in the area, as the Viceroy himself did not order Vizafañe to evacuate the colony. Vizafañe relented and agreed that it would be proper to maintain a colony until ordered otherwise. He left 50 soldiers, likely the 50 men that he brought himself. Then he took de Luna's survivors, less than 300 in total, away from the Mobile Bay area. Assuming all of the 100 sick returned earlier lived, which is doubtful, less than 400 in total survived out of de Luna's original 1,500 colonists. When sufficient ships arrived, they sailed for Cuba. De Luna was allowed to take a ship from Cuba to Spain so that he could tell the king himself his side of the story, for which he appeared to be to blame for much of the human misery. The crown denied his request for financial compensation. The 50 men lingered at Pensacola Mobile Bay for another 6 or 7 months until they received word from the Viceroy to pack it in. Villafaña, unsatisfied with his own efforts, determined that he should move forward and create a settlement at Santa Elena. Because the Viceroy had ordered Santa Elena to be the end of the chain of forts and settlements, and de Luna had failed everywhere else in the plan, he might as well just try out this one last site. It remained untested. Villafaña only managed to recruit 90 of de Luna's original colonists to travel to Santa Elena. Setting sail, they arrived May 21st, 1561, where the Spanish concluded that Santa Elena, despite rumors of the French having interest in the area, was unsuitable for human settlement. Villafaña, for the sake of due diligence, then sailed perhaps as far north as Cape Hatteras in modern-day North Carolina before a storm gave them cause to return to the Caribbean. So-called Spanish Florida had yet again rid itself of the Spanish. De Luna returns from Spain to the New World a complete failure. Somewhere south of 27% of his colonists survived this colonization attempt, and his successor found nothing worth preserving and abandoned the effort altogether. So what can we say of de Luna? For the man himself, he did build himself back up and became governor of the Yucatan, a post his father once had. And in relation to the history of Spanish Florida, Tristan de Luna is the first so-called governor of Florida to survive Spanish Florida. Ponce de Leon, de Ayllon, Narvaez, de Soto, Barbastro all died in pursuit of making Florida Spanish. De Luna, perhaps only due to the efforts of Father Domingo and his own humility to ask for forgiveness, survives his episode of the Other States of America History podcast. Believe it or not, things are looking up for the Spanish. But tune in next time when the Spanish discover a secret French colony within their claim to North America.